Hello, my name is Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to vlog 172, the first academic job. And quite appropriately, I'm delivering the vlog this week from my first full-time academic job. It was a one-year job at the Victoria University in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this is an important vlog for me personally, but I hope it is professionally, because I have been asked by many of our students to talk about how to get that first academic job. So for one group of students, this is an incredibly important experience and vlog, and I'll offer expertise for you. But I'm also very conscious that for a large group of our students, you are already successful professionals, you're already in work, you have families, you have caring responsibilities, and so therefore the first academic job is not terribly relevant to you. So for some of our students, terribly important, and for other groups of our students, not relevant at all. You're doing a PhD to add to your already amazing career. But for a particular group of students, you want to know how to get the party started. And that's why this vlog is in place. And I am going to start with my story at the Vic in this place. My first job, I think, was just over in that building there. Start with my story of the Vic and then show the research that is required to make this first job functional and effective for you. So let me tell you about this place. Let me tell you about this job. I'd already completed a research master's in a very traditional conservative history department, and I was 1 year in my PhD and on scholarship. But that, of course, was in cultural studies. I'd moved universities, I'd moved disciplines. And like many of you in my PhD program, I was tutoring in somebody else's course. It wasn't a very good course, but I loved tutoring. And that tutoring experience nested very effectively with my PhD. But my PhD supervisor, who was also the guy who was the lecturer teaching in this course, was not only a dreadful supervisor, he was also a dreadful first year teacher as well. So the gift that keeps on giving. And he told me with a smirk, and I remember this to this very day, he told me with a smirk in May 1994 that I would be teaching in his first year courses until I was 35. And he laughed when he said that. I was 24 at the time. And as you can imagine, I was horrified, I was disgusted. I thought, wow, this is the next decade of my life tutoring for this dreadful man. But can I report, not only was I not tutoring for that guy when I was 35, I was a professor when I was 35. Now, how did I get from tutoring in a first year course for a pretty dreadful person at 24 to a professor at 35? It did happen, and probably one of the reasons it did is the year I spent here at the Victoria University in Wellington. How did it happen? Well, I was notified by my former head of school at that traditional history department where I did my master's degree that the Victoria University needed a really fast replacement to teach a large first year survey course in European history and also offer a couple of electives as a second year course. And the staff member would have to arrive in Wellington and be in Wellington in 1 month to start to commence the teaching of that course. And no one else, none of the current PhD students in that traditional history department wanted to go. So he asked me to see if I would go. And what had happened was, why the gap existed in the teaching at the Vic is a male staff member won a research grant, and he decided at speed, oh yes, well I'm going to leave for the year and I'm going to do this research grant to help my career. Didn't care too much about the students that would be impacted by that research decision, and that's important too. So the first lesson from this tale emerges. The first job that you're going to have a chance of getting is going to emerge at incredibly short notice. So maternity leave is going to happen, a staff member will resign very quickly, there might be a sickness issue, or indeed there may be a research grant. And that first job will be a contract job. You will be required to teach a lot and teach quickly under pretty poor conditions. Now, when I told my PhD supervisor, I remember the guy, when I told the PhD supervisor that I was off to Wellington, that I was going to have a teaching job for a year and go, he said, "Oh no, you can't go to New Zealand. If you go to New Zealand, you'll never make it back to Australia. Like, sort of, New Zealand is hell and you'll just never make it back from hell." Now, he was wrong there. I was back in Australia in a full-time academic job in a year, but there is a lesson there. The second big lesson I want you to get from this story is that your supervisor, almost all of your supervisors, have gained work in more benevolent times. So they've lived in kinder times for higher education. So their expectations, their notions about universities and higher education are not accurate for what is going to be involved to get you in work and you a job. And you are going to have to make some very difficult choices that are outside of the experience of your PhD supervisor. So what type of jobs are we talking about here? What type of conditions? Well, your pay will be mediocre at best, and the staff you are teaching with and teaching for won't care about you really at all, because you're simply a temporary replacement for a permanent staff member. So let's talk about money. I'm not going to pull any punches today. Let's talk about dough. So when I was at the Vic, I was paid 30,000 New Zealand dollars net for that academic year. Now, of course, that seemed a huge amount of money to me at the time. But let me tell you some other stuff. The only accommodation I could get close enough to the university so I wouldn't need a car to get to work, and a fully furnished flat, in fact it was a cellar flat, cost me $2,000 a month. So work it out, 12 months, $24,000 in rent for the year before we've even begun. It cost me $800 to move some of my stuff from Perth in Western Australia to Wellington, so clothes and staff stuff for my PhD, so I could actually do the work. And the university promised to cover that. They didn't. What they ended up doing was advancing $800 from my first month's salary to pay for that movement. Now, I lost 2 stone while I was working this year at the Vic, and trust me, it wasn't a nice 2 stone to lose. I lost it not from choice, but because I couldn't afford to eat properly. And so for the entire year I was at the Vic, I lived on bagged rice, carrots, and canned Tong sweet and sour sauce. And to this day, I can't even manage the scent of the stuff. So that's what I lived on. And bottom line, by the end of the academic year that I worked at the Vic, my financial spreadsheet was pretty clear. I was $700 in the red. So I'd worked an entire year and I was $700 behind. Now, this all seems incredibly negative, and it's a negative story, but let me also tell you the great stuff, the important stuff, the wonderful stuff that happened. I finished my PhD by the conclusion of this 1-year contract. So I had 1 year full-time before I took the job. I then went part-time for the year, and I finished the PhD while I was here. And that's because I had to, because I had no chance of getting the next job if I didn't have a completed PhD. So this is when I started getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I finished that PhD 3 a.m. to 5:30 in the morning before I started my day's work at the Vic. And that meant simply when the contract ended, which it would, there were no promises, it was 1 year, that I had a fighting chance of getting the next post back in Australia. And you know what? I did get a great post back in Australia. And the short list, and this is the important bit of this story, the short list included 2 men much older than I am. They were both in a full-time academic post. So if I'd been a tutor at my former university working for my supervisor, I wouldn't have been shortlisted. But the 3 people that applied were all in full-time work. I demonstrated I was a great and strong first-year teacher. I also demonstrated I was research active, and I had a completed PhD. So I beat those men on the day. But also I think the pressure involved in teaching hundreds of hours in a job such as this really does build you as a teacher. It makes you as a human, I think. And I was doing 3 lectures a week, 8 tutorials a week, and I learnt through pretty brutalising experience how to be a pretty good educator. And of course that's experiential, so through experience, so simply doing hour upon hour upon hour, you improve as a teacher. But I also realised something else during this year, that I started to know what I didn't know. And so the following year I enrolled in my first education program, so I would start to know what I know. In this place I learnt so much about myself, but it's also an incredibly sad story too, because I was incredibly happy in Perth in Western Australia, and to take this job at the Vic I had to leave my life, my family, my friends, everything that made me incredibly happy, and I had to move and land in a place where I didn't know a single person. It was cruel, it was hard, it was damn cold. Can I say it's still damn cold in Wellington? And there were plenty of nights, and I'm not embarrassed to say this, there were plenty of nights where I cried myself to sleep and said to myself, what am I doing here? But I survived because I knew I had to. I had one chance. I had to make this job successful, so I had a chance of an academic career. If I went home going, oh look, I just can't manage it, I would never have had the chance again. So I had to make it work, and I did. And finally, I gained incredible insights about Aotearoa, New Zealand, by living here. And a big chunk of my heart still lives in Wellington. I adore this place, I love this place with a passion. And it does feel like home to me, just like Manchester feels like home to me. Other cities, I've worked around the world, other cities are nice, other cities are interesting, but there's something about Wellington, there's something about Manchester. I've lived here, I've worked here, they're walkable cities. You have an intimacy with the rhythms of the streets that don't exist really in other cities. And I also, to this day, feel the expansive power of Oriental Bay. But from this year, in this singular experience, I knew that I could move. I could manage being in a foreign place, and I could work well in that place. I could land and start, and it would be successful. The rest of my career followed that example. And I always ask, what would have happened if I'd stayed in Western Australia as a tutor for my PhD supervisor? Life is like this. I took this path. What would have happened if I'd stayed in Perth, worked for that guy? What would have occurred? And look, we'll never know those alternative trajectories of our life. But I don't think, in fact I know, that I wouldn't be where I am now if I'd stayed in Perth working for that guy. And this year in Wellington meant that I lived and read widely about New Zealand and New Zealand history. And my first book, published in the year 2000, was titled Tracking the Jack, a retracing of the Antipodes. And that book would not have been written without this year in Wellington. And Tracking the Jack had absolutely nothing to do with my PhD, no connection of any kind. And this new knowledge, this new experience, this new context created this incredible new research project. So the first job that many of us gain at an age such as I was, and I was 24, this is a rare socialisation these days. You're a young person, do an honours degree, do a master's degree, do a PhD, get the first job. That's a rare socialisation. But when that does happen to you, and it will happen to some of you, it makes you as a human. It makes you as a scholar. It breaks the predictability of how you thought your life would be, and it creates and it forges a different trajectory of your life beyond your supervisor's imagining. This is a different kind of life. So what sort of lessons are we gaining here? What do we see in the research as we move from casual part-time work to a contract job? What's happening in academic life when you make that movement? Firstly, you will continue to be underpaid, and the conditions that you'll experience will tend to be pretty appalling. You are doing a teaching job. You have been hired to do a teaching job, and therefore you are invisible in the department. But learn what you can. Pay your bills, and know that you have to use this time so that the next job you improve your conditions, you improve your pay, and you improve your stability. A recent article in The Guardian, written by an anonymous academic, so they weren't prepared to put their name to it, was titled, quote, "I just got a permanent academic job, but I'm not celebrating," end of quote. It's a very disturbing piece, but one of the powerful quotes from it is the author, whoever this person was, described, quote, "Such vast inequalities in power creates fertile grounds for abuse," end of quote. So because of the incredible inequalities that exist in the university sector, abuse does emerge. And the power games in universities makes Game of Thrones look like Jenga, really. And the casual staff and those junior staff, like many of you will be on a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year or 5 year contract, you are vulnerable. You are deeply vulnerable, and you can and you often are discarded by this system. So the advice from the literature for these early jobs is clear. Look after your health. Keep yourself fit, keep yourself as well as you can. Secondly, look after your money. Focus on the pay, be careful with it. But also be flexible. Gain new skills. You are going to be in a new environment with new technology, new software, new hardware, new interfaces, new expectations, new knowledge. Really exciting. So learn, and learn quickly. Be a self-starter. That's what these jobs teach you. Be a self-starter. If you're waiting for somebody to help you get a grant or explain the system or help you with your research and your teaching, you're going to be waiting a really, really long time, because academic life is competitive, it's nasty, and it's ruthless. And you are there to teach a large number of undergraduate students. That's simply what you have been hired to do. But don't, please do not lose your research, no matter what. No matter what, because the research is what will get you the next job. So to gain a good contract post 3 to 5 years or even permanence, you will need to show that you are an outstanding teacher, absolutely, because that pays the bills. But you need to show also that you are an outstanding researcher. You need to be both. So I used that year I spent in Wellington at the Vic to show I can teach very large first year courses incredibly successfully at speed. But I also finished my PhD. What about the research? Well, this is important. I produced 5 singly authored articles during my honours and my masters. I produced 5 articles during the year I was at the Vic, with 6 planned articles for the year after my PhD. So that meant that I could be hired for the next job. I was research active, highly research active, but I also had a research trajectory for the time I would spend in the next job. And also recognise, for all the interdisciplinary scholars out there, you have wider options for employment. No one ever talks about this. The literature is undercooked on it, uses different language, but let me get real on it. Now, my master's degree was in history. My PhD was not on history, but my first job was in a conservative history department here at the Vic. My next job was in a regional university in a communication studies department, and I've been Professor of Cultural Studies, Communication Studies, Creative Media, and Education. So guys, what you're picking up is the interdisciplinary research and teaching provides options for work. You can move where the work is, and the options are wider for you. Finally, when you get the job, please, for me, get the job, sign the contract, but I want you to negotiate the conditions. Remember to make sure there is a figure in place for moving expenses. Please, make sure there's some money to move your stuff. Make sure there's some transportation expenses. So they're paying for the airfare, they're paying to get you there. Also, and this is the trick, make sure there is a figure, even if it is $1,000, to pay something to get you away from that location at the conclusion of the contract. People forget about that. So they've got you over there, and of course they'll discard you at the end of the year. Make sure there's $1,000 at least to get you home. Also, be clear on your teaching load. In my first 3 jobs, senior academics would simply throw off their own courses and throw them at the junior staff member, often the week before semester starts. So try and say no if you can, because obviously people are just going to throw work at you, and you're so junior, because you're on a contract, you sort of say yes to hope the next job's going to happen. The next job won't happen, so make sure you're also protecting your time. Also, see if any housing support is available. Now, we all have to live somewhere. And Steve and I spent 3 years of the last 15 years of my life living in temporary accommodation, living in a room, living in a bed and breakfast, with our stuff in storage, 3 years. And the reason we did that is the work was so unstable, we didn't want to buy a house, because simply we're then in a worse situation than we were. If we're in a bad job and then we've got a house that we've got to sell, that's even worse. So it's not a bad idea to get temporary accommodation, be clear on it, so that you can leave at speed at the conclusion of that short contract. Also check out health support, make sure some healthcare strategies are in place for you, just in case you do get sick. And also for those of you with partners and children, this gets really, really complicated. The decisions that you're making become much more complex. Now, some institutions hire partners. They call that the trailing partner in the North American system, but you've got to see what is available. And let me just make one clear point here. If your partner is unhappy, then you're not even going to last a 1-year contract. So if it is 2 of you, let alone 2 of you with kids, that decision has to be made with your eyes open. It's going to be a hard year, and as a family, you've got to make sure you both understand what's going on there. Now, the maxim of my professional life has been, you will always be in work if you are prepared to move. And I have found that maxim accurate. It is a tough way to live. Wow, it is. Wow, it is. But it's also a brilliant one as well. Moving around the world, wow, has given me so much joy, and I've learned so much. It has been a brilliant life. It's weird, you know, I'm 50, as most of you know. I was 24 when I started the Vic, 25 when I left, so 25 years ago, in some ways, my professional life began in this institution. The journey started here with a 1-year appointment in Wellington. And if you can take the leap, if you can take that chance, the one thing I promise you is the view is absolutely amazing. From the beautiful Victoria University in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.